suggest that if you have questions, go ahead and ask me. If I make statements that you find offensive because they're inaccurate, let me know, and we'll try to correct them. I'll do the best I can. Okay.
All right, how's that? Very good. So, I've been a member of the SAR since 1998, so for about 27 years. And I was past president of the State Society in 2007. So I characterize the Marquis de Lafayette as a friend of George Washington and hero of two worlds. He was a very close friend of George Washington. When they met, they had an immediate appreciation for each other, and Washington took him under his arm and treated him as a son that he never had. At the time they met, Lafayette was 19 years old, very young. Well, hero of two worlds. Not only was he important to the United States in our development, getting through the American Revolution, he also had a big impact on France and their struggles as they went from a monarchy to a republic. They wanted it to be a constitutional monarchy, a monarch with a constitution. But it's been quite a struggle for France to work all that out. So in America, why is he held in such high regard? I'd like to impress upon you what he really meant to us. Lafayette came over. He became a brigadier general in the United States Army at age 19, but he was not given command, but he earned the respect of everyone and later did do a command. Part of that was in Virginia. After Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis had gone with his army was down to 1,200 men in strength after Guilford Courthouse, 2,200 before Guilford Courthouse. He had lost so many men he couldn't command an army in the field. So he had gone for resupply, first to Wilmington and then to go over to Yorktown. At Yorktown, he was given orders to create a deep-water port for the British. Well, George Washington was up in New York with Rochambeau, and they had up 7,000 or 8,000 troops, and they wanted to defeat the British at New York. They wanted to take them out of New York. That's where Washington thought they should fight the British. Well, if you're fighting in New York, you can imagine that the enemy is there with the citizens of America. So it would be an urban scene and trying to do battle, and you do a lot of damage. So there was a reluctance to go into New York, but Lafayette came up with a plan, and he contacted George Washington and said, look, instead of fighting the British in New York, why don't you bring the troops down to Yorktown, where we have Cornwallis, we can bottle him up there, and it would make for a nice opportunity. Now, the reason that Lafayette was making this suggestion to George Washington was that he had a friend, James Armistead Lafayette. James Armistead later took the name Lafayette. James was a slave, and he could pass between the British camp and the American camp. They didn't challenge him. So he was listening to what the British were talking about and found out that their plan was to stay in Yorktown for several months, improving the port there. So that's when he came up with the idea, go to Washington, get him to bring the troops down. Well, now, for Washington to come down to Yorktown, he's got to move 7,000 troops all the way from New York down to Virginia. You don't do that lightly. That would have been a major effort. But Lafayette convinced Washington. He was the one, I believe, that came up with the idea, but he had a major part in influencing Washington to come down to Virginia. Okay? He developed that strategy. Also, then, he had, Washington asked Lafayette to get de Grasse, who was the French Navy officer with ships down in the Caribbean, Jamaica area, and get de Grasse to come up to help in this battle against the British. If you go back in history, those major campaigns involve the Navy in one way or the other. And in this case, that was going to be the situation. So de Grasse was convinced to come up and to attack the British Navy there at Yorktown. And in August he came up, and on September the 5th they had the Battle of the Capes. The French were successful. They had 28 ships of the line, including de Grasse's flagship, which was one of those with 3 rows of cannons, 100 or some cannons. And they did battle. The French ran the British off. And they said, de Grasse was saying, okay, we've done that. Now it's time for me to get out of here before the British can bring their Navy down from New York and attack me, bottled up in the Cape, Chesapeake Bay. So he was not comfortable in staying. Well, the Battle of Yorktown wasn't until October. So this was 6 weeks before they were fighting the Battle of Yorktown. Washington wanted de Grasse to stay there in Chesapeake Bay, waiting for his arrival with Rochambeau so they could fight the British there at Yorktown. They needed him to stay there. So Washington sent Lafayette on board de Grasse's flagship to talk with him and convince him to stay. And you can imagine, here's this 20-year-old going into this mature Navy officer from France who's been around all over. He's got some age on him. And he's looking at this young upstart come in and tell him he's got to maintain his Navy there at risk for a couple of weeks while George Washington makes his way down to Yorktown. And he didn't want to do that. But Lafayette had more money than de Grasse had, and he had the ear of the French king, Louis XVI. So de Grasse reluctantly agreed and stayed. So when the battle occurred, Washington and Rochambeau had come down, and when they were battling there at Yorktown, they had dug trenches. They were moving in closer and closer. To break into where the British were, they decided to take redoubts number 9 and 10. The harder one, the 10 was right up against the south side of the York River there. The redoubt 9 was just a little bit inland, a little bit harder to take. Redoubt 10 was protected on one side. Washington gave Lafayette the command of taking redoubt number 9, which he did, and did a really good job. And then he gave Alexander Hamilton the duty on the American side of taking redoubt 10. So if you look on your $10 bill, you'll see Alexander Hamilton's face. That was put on there for honor that he took redoubt number 10 in Yorktown. Lafayette didn't get his image on any of our currency. But can you imagine if we had not had Lafayette? The Battle of Yorktown is what gave us the American Revolution. Lafayette gave us the Battle of Yorktown. And also, in addition to that, in 1979, Washington sent Lafayette back to France. for aid. We needed money to pay the troops. We needed armaments, all sorts of things to continue to field an army. And that was kind of a low point then. Lafayette took that on, spent a year in France, and came back with basically enough aid and military supplies to bankrupt the country of France. So when we think about what did Lafayette do for us, do we give him enough homage? Do we, respect him enough? He gave us Yorktown, and he outfitted our army. So you have to say, yes, this was a guy that really, really made a difference. Also in France, Lafayette went back after the Revolution. He wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was a 1 or 2 page document, not huge, but read like the Bill of Rights. And the French put that in their constitution when they got around to doing that, and he was the author of that document. So not only did he have a major influence here in the United States, but also in France. So that's why I've been proud to be talking about Lafayette. Let me see if I can get this to work. Well, I'm going to. I'll just tap. Okay. Thank you. So, a little about Lafayette. He descended from the house of Lafayette. And if you look at his name, Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Mathieu de Lafayette. Notice that Lafayette is not one word. So the Fayette family he was part of the Fayette family, and his name says of the Fayettes. So when you talk about, you say, well, we have Fayetteville, which was named in honor of Lafayette. That's Fayetteville is for the Fayette part of that. And I often wondered, how does Fayetteville and Lafayette, why would it be that way? So born in 1757, he lived to be 77 years old. He was 68 when he came back for that visit here in America in 1824. And he was 67, 68 at that time. Lafayette's father died when he was 2 years old at the hands of the British. So that's one of the reasons that Lafayette was interested in fighting with America against the British. In the 7 Years' War, the British sent a cannonball his way, and he was killed by the cannonball. His mother died when he was 13 in 1770, so he was orphaned at 13. But he didn't do too badly. He got all the money from the family, and he was one of the 10 richest people in Europe at that time. So when he was raised, he was quite privileged. Marquis, which is part of his name that we think of him, is a title inherited from his great-grandfather, Charles, for valor on the battlefield. So that's where that Marquis name comes from. Okay, here's the Lafayette coat of arms. Up at the top it says Kernon. That translates to why not. I thought that was kind of interesting. And this is a crest of the House of Lafayette. Okay. So this is his boyhood home. And you look up in the top right, you see a map there of France. So Lafayette's boyhood home, Chateau de Chavignon, is in the Auvergne region of France, 250 miles south of Paris. So you see that red area there in the map of France? His family controlled that area. That was his family's possession. It is 35 miles east-west by 75 miles north-south, just to give you an idea of what he was able to control. His wife that he married was from the northwest region up there, and when they got married, he also controlled a lot of that. So he was quite wealthy. That's his boyhood home. This chateau had been in his family for 2 generations. And he lived there till he was 11 years old. Interestingly, he didn't have a father and mother. His mother had gone off to Paris. His father had died. And he spent a lot of time playing with children from the neighborhood who were not born of aristocratic parents. So he would hunt and fish and spend time with them. And that gave him a feel for wanting to help the less fortunate. And that carries through for the rest of his life. Okay. So Lafayette was raised by his grandmother, 2 aunts, and a cousin. He also had a tutor, Abby Fyon, and he was tutored in basic education, along with military and cultural history. At 11 years old, Lafayette left this chateau and he moved to Paris to be with his mother. In Paris, he studied for 4 years at the Collège du Plessis. It's a private school for nobility where he studied math, history, geography, theology, law, and Caesar's commentaries. When Lafayette was 16, his grandfather arranged a marriage for him. And this was 4 years before he came to the U.S. All right. So he was married at 16. He was engaged at age 14 and his wife is up there in the top right, Marie Adrienne Francois de Noyes. Their marriage would last for 33 years. When the engagement was announced, she was 12 years old. He was 14. And guess what? Her mother was not happy about this arranged relationship and kept her daughter protected for 2 years. They saw each other occasionally. And at that time, it was chaperoned. At age 16, Lafayette and Adrienne married. She was 14, he was 16. Her dowry was 200,000 livres, which is basically about worth $2 million today. The marriage contract was signed by Louis XVI and his 3 sons. That tells you about the influence that Lafayette and his family had. When they wanted to get married, they got the King of France to sign the marriage contract. Both families were tied to the court in Versailles, but Lafayette did not like the court there at Versailles. Okay, so he and Adrienne had 4 children. The first, I showed 3 across the bottom. The first one had died at 2 years old, so he did not survive to adulthood. But Anastasie, there on the left, Louise Pauline du Mater would live to be 86 years old. In the middle, George Washington Lafayette, named after George Washington, would live to be 70 years old. And on the right, that's Marie Antoinette Virginie Montier, named for Virginia, the state of Virginia, and lived to be 67 years old. Well, Lafayette, as he was coming along, decided he wanted a military career. His father had been in the military, his grandfather. He thought that's what he should do, and his family supported that decision. And he had was completing the 4 years at the College de Places. He was first commissioned in the French Army, in the French Guard, the Black Musketeers. And that was in 1771. He was age 13. The Sioux lieutenant is basically, it's a lower lieutenant, it's a second lieutenant. When I graduated at BMI, we followed the French custom, and all the graduating cadets there are commissioned as second lieutenants also. But anyway, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, but at age 13. He marched and wore a uniform, but had no command. After marriage, Lafayette and Adrienne moved into a mansion in Versailles and attended court, getting to know Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and other nobility. So when Lafayette was 17, Louis XVI was 21. They were only 4 years apart in age. And they rode, hunted with each other, and that kind of thing. So they had a relationship. But Lafayette did not like court life. He didn't fit in well there. He was rather unsophisticated. He'd lived 11 years out in the country, and he liked that better. He didn't take to the frivolity of decadent court life. He was not a big drinker. He was a bad dancer. So he spent as little time as possible at Versailles Court. Well, he was promoted to captain in the Noailles Dragoons at 17 years old. He also became a mason in the lodge in Paris for nobility, the Saint Jean de la Candeur Masonic Lodge. He was, unfortunately though, about 1775, France was not at war. They had not joined America yet, and they had a need, they felt, to reduce their national debt and cut back on expenses. So what they did was they inactivated the army of France. They put them on reserve status. So here's a young guy, 17, 18 years old, wants to make a career in the military, and finds that his country is letting the military kind of retire or go into reserve status. And that didn't bode well for him wanting a career in the military. So he was looking for something else to do, found out about what was going on in America, and that suited him. So he decided that in order to advance, he needed to come to America and join where the fighting was going on, the forces here in America. So he made friends with Baron Johann de Kalb, who introduced him to Silas Deane, who was over there in Europe, I think in France. And Lafayette signed a contract with Silas Deane on December the 7th of 1776. We had already declared independence. Lafayette signed a contract with Silas Deane to provide his services to the United States as a major general and without pay. That's a 2-star general. So at 19 years old, first thing he had to do was get over here to the United States, and that wasn't easy because the King of France, Louis XVI, did not want to disrupt relationships with Great Britain by declaring war on Great Britain. If they joined the United States and made a big show of that, that in essence was going against Great Britain. And France was trying to avoid that image. So they had some French officers who had come over to the United States, but Louis XVI did not want Lafayette to come over here because of his high profile. Well, Lafayette wanted to come over, so he purchased a ship to go to America in February of 1777, paying 112,000 livres. It was equipped with 2 cannons, and he named it La Victory, the Victory. He had to sneak out of France because Louis XVI had forbade him from coming over here. So he dressed as a maid, went down to the port, and snuck on board the ship, and they got out away from the land soon enough that the French Navy could not catch him and bring him back. He landed, anybody know where he landed? It's kind of interesting. He landed in Georgetown, South Carolina. Yeah. So he couldn't go in New York or Baltimore or Norfolk or Charleston. The British were in there and he'd be captured. He couldn't, he was being sought, you know, they were looking for him anyway. So he came in Georgetown, South Carolina, a lesser known port. His ship, the Victory, ran aground in the mud flats right there in Georgetown. And they sent out a flat bottom boat, brought him to shore, and he got a horse and went down to Charleston. In Charleston, they feted him with some banquets and gave him a carriage with a couple of horses, and he set out for Philadelphia. The carriage fell apart after 10 miles, unfortunately. So he ended up making his way to Philadelphia, to Continental Congress, on horse. Now, George Washington saw him when he came in. The Continental Congress turned him down when he said Silas Deane had given him a contract. They didn't need French officers, didn't want to pay him. So he was turned down. But as a Mason, he had a special handshake. George Washington recognized that, got to talking to him, and he said, look, I've got this letter from Benjamin Franklin, Ben Franklin had told Washington, sent a letter by way of Lafayette, that he ought to listen to this guy, that he had major influence in France, could become a huge advantage for us, and that he ought to engage his service. And he didn't require being paid. Lafayette had learned French quickly on the trip from France to Philadelphia, learned English. He had fought at Brandywine. So he comes over in 1777, and he's made a 2-star general, assigned to Washington as an aide, basically, not given a command, but he ends up going to the Battle of Brandywine, and on the 4 days after he turned 20 years old, he gets wounded in the left leg. It was a flesh wound in the calf. It did fill his boot with blood, and he did have a short 2-month convalescence period. So he missed out on Saratoga in October of 1777. He got shot in September of 1777. So after Saratoga, France joined the United States and declared war on Great Britain. And Lafayette then was able to have another opportunity to fight at the Battle of Gloucester near Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, in November 25th of 1777. I want to just describe what he did there at Gloucester for you. General Greene was leading a raiding party to attack Cornwallis's camp in New Jersey. After ferrying across the Delaware River, General Greene arrayed his 3,000 troops in a defensive position. Greene put Lafayette in command of about 350 men. This is his first command. And ordered him to find Cornwallis's camp, which he believed to be about 10 miles east. Lafayette had in his command 200 of Dan Morgan's famed rifle from the Battle of Saratoga. Okay, along with 2 companies of New Jersey militia. The party ran into a group of Cornwallis's Hessian pickets near Gloucester, and Lafayette did not hesitate, ordering his men to charge the enemy, frontal assault. They routed the Hessians, then attacked the British camp, which was defended by 350 enemy troops and 2 cannons. When the smoke cleared, Lafayette had banished the enemy, which suffered 60 casualties to Lafayette's just 6. For the Americans, 1 killed and 5 wounded. That's a major accomplishment in anybody's book. Well, General Greene was especially pleased with Lafayette, what he had accomplished, and he praised him for his daring and effective leadership under fire in a letter to George Washington. When Washington received the report, Washington sent a message to Congress singing Lafayette's praises and requested that he be given a division to command. I am convinced, Washington wrote, he possesses a large share of that military spirit which generally characterizes the nobility of his country. He went to New Jersey with General Greene, and I find that he has been active. Congress agreed, and on December the 4th, 1777, Lafayette, at just 20 years old, was given command of a battalion of soldiers from the state of Virginia. Imagine that, 20-year-old guy, 2-star general, commanding soldiers, much older than he was. Well, to add to his happiness, Lafayette learned also that his second daughter, Anastasia, had been born. Unfortunately, he would also learn soon after that his 2-year-old daughter, Henriette, had died. So he had lost one and had another one born. Well, next, Lafayette was called upon by Continental Congress to take a campaign against Canada. So they wanted him to go up through Fort Ticonderoga and go north from Albany, New York, and take Montreal, Canada, or convince the French there at Montreal that they should join with the American forces. You know, there was quite a bit of effort several times for us to get the Canadians to join with us during the American Revolution, and they refused to do that. Part of that was that most of them were Catholic, and they didn't like the way that they thought they should. So Lafayette is given a command to go to Montreal and confiscate British arms and ammunition and get as many soldiers, if not, convince them that they should join our cause. Well, Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, was put in charge of the planning. And you remember George Washington had been, rather than going to Saratoga, he had been at Monmouth and he had lost. So Horatio Gates was becoming popular in Continental Congress. So Horatio Gates did not like Lafayette. So he was in charge of the mission. So when Lafayette, in the dead of winter in February of 1778, reaches Albany, he found only 1,200 of the promised 2,500 men for the mission. Neither did he get the provisions promised, and the men had not been paid in some time, and they were disgruntled. So Lafayette had been set up for failure by Horatio Gates. When word reached Congress that the mission was fumbled by Gates, nearly all of the anti-George Washington sentiment in Congress ended. Horatio Gates never again became a factor in the war. Lafayette had uncovered a plot called the Conway Cabal, or Cabal, to remove Washington as commander-in-chief of the American Army. Lafayette's action resulted in an end to the plot led by Brigadier General Thomas Conway to replace Washington with Horatio Gates. Yes, Lafayette was at Valley Forge with Washington. He spent the winter there, 1777-78. Well, another example of his leadership was at the Battle of Barren Hill, just north of Philadelphia. The British had occupied Philadelphia in September of 1777. In May of 78, Lafayette was given command of 2,200 soldiers guarding an intersection of 3 roads leading to Philadelphia, just 10 miles north. A British division of 5,000 troops found out that Lafayette was there, and they plotted right away to encircle and trap Lafayette. Well, Lafayette was successful in assessing his situation and getting away from the trap. Apparently there was a road down by a river that was more of a trail than a path that had been used frequently. The British did not know that path was there. Lafayette found out about it and led his men down a road, off the main road, and Lafayette escaped without his troops being captured. Another major accomplishment. So Lafayette also fought at Monmouth and Newport, Rhode Island. And Lafayette, being able to speak French and having a reputation in France, was able to deal with the Comte d'Estaing when he arrived in July 1778 with 12 ships of the line, 4 frigates, and 4,000 French soldiers. It seems that the American officers and the French had a problem communicating. And Lafayette was able not only to speak the language, but also was very influential in smoothing over issues between the French and the Americans repeatedly. He was Washington's interpreter and smoothed over egos and helped create trust. Washington agreed for Lafayette to return to France in 1799 for much needed aid aboard the American ship Alliance. And as a negotiator going to France, Lafayette was larger than life. He left France as a wealthy nobleman. He came to America, joined the army, risked his life, even took a bullet for us at Brandywine. Without his help, we would not have been able to arm ourselves. The colonies had no trained military, no arms, no uniform shoes, no military leaders, no navy, and we were going up against the most powerful military force in the world. France coming to our aid was absolutely necessary. For funds to pay our soldiers, for cannon, muskets, powder and shot, uniforms, cloth, troops, and of course the Navy. Lafayette had the ear of Louis XVI and got us the aid we desperately needed with the help of Silas Deane and Ben Franklin. We owe him a huge debt for his help in winning our independence. Then Lafayette and Adrienne, while he was there, back in France, had their son, George Washington, was born. So Lafayette then returns to America in April 1780, about a year after he had gone back. He had gotten French to promise to send over 6,000 troops. He arrived on the ship there in the top, upper right, named Hermione. The French fleet under Rochambeau was spotted off the coast of Boston in July of 1780, but only 5,000 Marines and sailors and 3,000 soldiers, not the 6,000 promised, and many of those sick and exhausted from the trip. So Lafayette got to writing letters back to France, expressing the need for additional troops, money, and supplies, and was very helpful in getting the French to coordinate activities with Washington. Unfortunately, about that time, Benedict Arnold attempted to give West Point to the British in 1780 on September the 23rd. So he was a traitor. His plan could have involved the British capture also of George Washington. I don't know if you were aware of that, but the plan that he gave the British to capture West Point involved George Washington being there when the British arrived. And they would have gotten not only West Point, but George Washington. Well, they had a tribunal for John Andre. Unfortunately, Benedict Arnold escaped capture, so he was not, they didn't try him, but his accomplice there, John Andre, was tried. Lafayette was appointed as one of the jurors on that trial. Then the Battle of Yorktown, and as I said, Lafayette was given a command there. And he had 1,000 Continentals, 200 militia, and he marched with the American army down to Yorktown. They trapped Cornwallis. Cornwallis had over 8,000 soldiers. Americans had about 16,000, twice his numbers, with 7,500 French, 5,700 American Continental Army soldiers, and 3,200 American militia. The point here is, of the force that fought there at Yorktown, 7,500 were French, and Lafayette was instrumental in getting those men there. Lafayette returned to France, 1781, after Battle of Yorktown, 2 months after. His purpose was to continue to advocate for financial support, opening up trade also with the U.S. and France, and sending more troops as peace negotiations dragged on for 2 years. Lafayette received a hero's welcome upon landing in France and received the king's highest military honor, the Cross of St. Louis, from King Louis XVI. Lafayette was also made Maréchal de Camp, the equivalent of Field Marshal, Major General in the French Army. So he goes back to France, and they appoint him in charge of the French Army. And his daughter, Marie Antoinette Virginie, was born, named to honor the French Queen and the home state of his commander, George Washington. So the Treaty of Paris, 1783, finally ended the war, and Britain recognized American independence. Lafayette came back again, a third time, to America, this time in 1784, in celebration of the recent independence of the U.S., stayed for 4 months and traveled 10 states. He received rapturous greetings everywhere he went. Everybody turned out. He was conferred honorary American citizenship by the states of Maryland, Connecticut, and Virginia. He spent 10 days at Mount Vernon with George Washington and traveled with James Madison. He took an interest in helping to settle disputes with American Indians. At that time, we were having a little problem. They had not been treated very well with the end of the American Revolution. They had fought on the wrong side. Lafayette played a central role in negotiating a major treaty within the Iroquois and 6 Indian nations. So when he came over, he voluntarily got involved in that and smoothed over relations between America our new government and the Indians. In 1784, he addressed Congress, praising the nation's leaders and military who had fought. He labeled the U.S. an immense temple of freedom. He expressed his wish that the U.S. would stand as a lesson to oppressors and hope for the oppressed. He called for the U.S. to be a sanctuary for the rights of mankind. He returned to France in 1785. Back in France, took up the cause of social and political reform. He used the American experience as an example and spoke out strongly for religious freedom for Protestants. At that time in France, Protestants couldn't get married. That's outlawed. So he was trying to get those types of things changed. He fought hard for it. Criminal law reforms. He was opposed to the upper class abuses of the lower class and fought to change that. And also against slavery. He detested slavery. His stance was not appreciated by the ruling class, as you can imagine. King Louis XVI decided to remove his rank and military commission. Lafayette then bought a plantation in South America, French Guyana, to house 70 ex-slaves and provide them with jobs and education, showing that they could support themselves if given the chance. And he worked to abolish the slave trade. He used his influence to help establish free trade zones at several French ports to eliminate customs duties and help the American economy. Lafayette's efforts helped stimulate American trade with both France and Spain. Then the French Revolution. So Lafayette, as I said earlier, had penned the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Thomas Jefferson was involved in writing that also. So he worked with Thomas Jefferson, and that was basically a Bill of Rights for France. It was introduced to the National Assembly in 1789 and had the impact in France of Thomas Paine's 47-page pamphlet, Common Sense. It called for equality of all French people in the eyes of the law, guaranteed rights of liberty, property, and security, freedoms of speech, assembly, press, and religion. 4 days later, the Bastille was stormed by the peasants in France. So he published his Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and it had the effect of causing the French Revolution to break out. Anarchy spilled out in the streets. The National Assembly appointed Lafayette to take command of 30,000 strong police force. Lafayette pushed for the creation of a constitutional monarchy, having continued to have a king but a constitution. But instead, France chose a national convention with no ruling king. Lafayette found himself playing the middle of leading a revolution for the rights of man in support of peasants, but also trying to support the monarchy. So he was playing the middle. And that failed. The country was bankrupt, and Louis XVI was jailed and lost his head on January 21, 1793 by the guillotine. A lot of the aristocrats in France were also gathered up and treated in the same manner. Lafayette ended up losing the support of radical factors in control of France during the Reign of Terror, and his arrest was ordered. So they actually were going to cut his head off too. He and Adrienne had to leave France to avoid capture, and George Washington, Lafayette, his son, was sent to America for safety. This is a slide showing Lafayette as a prisoner. As he attempted to flee France, He was going to come to the United States in August 19, 1792, but was captured crossing the border into Austria, arrested and put in prison. He ended up spending 5 years in prison at Olmütz in Austria. He was released in 1797 with the help of Napoleon. It was 2 years before Lafayette could return to France in 1799. Napoleon Bonaparte seized power and became self-declared emperor of France for 4 years. Napoleon starts a world conquest, invading Russia in 1812, sent in 400,000 French soldiers. Only 6,000 came home. Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo finally on June the 18th, 1815, ending the Napoleonic Wars. The French National Assembly adopted the Charter of 1814, which incorporated Lafayette's ideals for individual rights, and it became the new Constitution of France. A constitutional monarchy ensued. Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI, is crowned King of France, extending the Bourbon line for another 10 years. Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI, not brother but son, was imprisoned and never actually ruled. He died in prison. Lafayette, in 1824, accepted an invitation from President James Monroe to return to the United States, his fourth and last visit. George Washington had died by that time, and help celebrate the upcoming 50th anniversary of the American Revolution. The trip would take 13 months, and he would travel 6,000 miles visiting all 24 states. He also visited West Point, Independence Hall, Washington, D.C., Washington's grave, historic battlefields from Yorktown to Brandywine, and met several of the past presidents, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, the present president, James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, and the future Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison. The country was in the midst of a contentious presidential election, and there were issues with the American Indians that needed to be resolved. In the 1824 election, John Quincy Adams had more electoral votes and defeated Andrew Jackson, who had more popular votes. Once again, Lafayette came to the aid of his adopted country, helping to smooth a divided country. He was the last living general officer of the American Revolution and was the pride of America, symbol of our successful struggle for independence, received the hero's welcome wherever he went, with whole towns turning out, willing to stand in the rain for hours to greet him. He ended his travels to amend the 50th anniversary by going to Boston, and was given the honor to lay the cornerstone for the marker, newly constructed Bunker Hill Monument there at Bunker Hill. So here's the tour that he made through the United States. He came in New York, went down into Virginia, and you see, came into North Carolina. I think I'm a pointer. So he came in New York, he comes down, crosses Virginia, goes back down to the Norfolk area, and then comes into North Carolina, comes across the state of North Carolina into South Carolina, where he goes down to Charleston and then over to Savannah, up to Augusta, and then crosses Georgia and Alabama, goes down and comes up through the Mississippi River by riverboat, makes a detour going up to Tennessee there, and on the way back, 3 o'clock in the morning, he's in a riverboat. Riverboat hit a snag and turned upside down in the river, and he got out safely. Anyway, back to the river, goes up to Louisville, Kentucky, up over to Lexington, and then on up into Ohio, and goes back to Boston, where he does the Bunker Hill Monument, back to Washington, D.C. And when he gets to Washington, D.C., he addresses Congress again and told them how thankful he was for what was going on and how delighted he was with what he saw here in the country. And they, in turn, awarded him $200,000. That was twice what they had paid George Washington. But they paid George Washington years before. Okay? And just something I found interesting, when Lafayette comes over for this tour at the invitation of the United States, he was destitute, he had no money left, all of his possessions had been taken. He had to borrow funds and sell some farm animals to be able to get fare to come over to the United States. So the $200,000 that Congress awarded him was a godsend for him, and he was able to save some grace there when he returned back to France. This shows the trip he took, or that we celebrated, that he took across North Carolina, coming in from Summerton, Virginia, into Murfreesboro, and then on over to Halifax, down to Enfield, and Falls of the Tar, and over to Raleigh, down to Fayetteville, and then into Sherrall, South Carolina. It rained, they said, every day for his tour through North Carolina. The streets were muddy, and on the occasion when he was coming from Summerton, Virginia, into Murfreesboro, his carriage, he rode the carriage almost everywhere, but it bottomed out in the mud all the way down to the axles, and they took something like 2 hours to get him out of that mud. Also, when he went down from Fayetteville to Sherrall in South Carolina, he also got stuck in the mud down there. So, but you know, he did these great distances, traveling day, night, and just, it's amazing that they could keep up the schedule that he did. He was awake like 20 hours a day, traveling, and going from place to place where he was feted with banquets and parades, everybody turned out and all that. So, yeah, these stops here in North Carolina. Just like to mention, as we're getting close to the end here, some of the honors that he has received. Over 600 cities, counties, squares, and streets have been named in his honor in the United States. Guess how many places in France have been named in his honor? Guess how many monuments they have to Lafayette in France? Who put it there? The American DAR. The French don't even know today, they don't remember who he was hardly. You can ask over there and they don't even know who he was. Okay, he's has ships named after him, a class of submarines, statues, stamps, currency, parks, mountain, even a bird, some colleges, and in World War